The Transformational Relationship, Part 1. Transformation, which is to say healing and growth, or to put it more dramatically, death and rebirth, is, I now believe, what all long-term intimate relationships are actually about. And perhaps even more accurately, what the unconscious of the individuals in the relationship is striving for. And while this is mainly romantic relationships, it does also take place in the therapeutic container and with long-term business partners, and perhaps even very deep, close friends. But for our purposes, I'll be focusing simply on the long-term intimate relationship variation, which is arguably the most important one. And this is also going to be a primer for really appreciating the genius of the Isis and Osiris myth, which is coming up next and is arguably the oldest written template we have of the successful transformational relationship. So get ready for all that nerdy, symbolic excitement to come. And so to begin, we are not simply having intimate relationships to alleviate our loneliness, our boredom, or to satisfy our sexual desires, or even to reproduce. That is not the primary purpose. But without generative evolutionary transformation, we will often settle for those things. And yet, all of those impulses, important though they may be, are, I believe, subservient to the mandate of transformation, which is initially driven by attraction, encouraged by the alleviation of loneliness, and then instantiated and celebrated through the process of reproduction or the expanding of family through adoption or other means, so that the new 2.0 psycho-emotional iteration that has been attained within the couple can be passed on to yet another more evolved rung on the lineage ladder. And this is how psycho-emotional evolution takes place over generations. It's a meeting and confrontation and cross-pollination of two usually diametrically opposed or complementary opposite psychic structures for the purpose of creating a more sophisticated synthesis. So yes, Paula Abdul was right. Opposites attract because they cover more genetic square footage when they do, which is also the esoteric meaning of the caduceus of Hermes. Yeah, the two snakes woven around the staff, which also represents the DNA helix. No surprise there, as well as the yin and the yang, if only they were spiralized, which is to say developmental, endlessly co-informing and co-influencing each other, winding into ever greater nuanced synthesis. This is also the alchemical marriage, otherwise known as the hieros gamos or the rosarium, all alchemical variations on the transformational relationship, which becomes radically easier and more enjoyable to engage in when we make it conscious and de-esotericize the process so that both members understand what is on offer, what is at stake, the cost, and most importantly, the role that each is being tasked to shepherd once the transformational process has been initiated. And this initiation of the transformational process within the couple is one that happens to all of us. And we should be clear about that. We don't activate it ourselves. It is activated of its own accord and usually without our awareness, right? So that we are unconscious of it. And always as a result of the psyche, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly perceiving that the relationship is now secure. And that's a really important opening piece, because I tell everyone I work with now who's starting a new relationship that once you get through courtship, whether we're scrutinizing all the micro patterns that reflect the macro, the as above, so below, to make sure that the complex and traumas of the other individual are in alignment with your own or not, and the honeymoon period then begins, I always say enjoy it, because a storm is coming. And this storm is like a tripwire that gets triggered when the psyche perceives the descending of a secure frame onto the relationship. Once again, whether truly secure or simply cosmetically secure, which could include moving in together, meeting the parents, planning that trip to Paris, or simply agreeing to be exclusive. When any of those tripwires suggestive of security are crossed, the psyche spontaneously begins to erupt waves of traumatic content that gush forth through the social mask for the purpose of being processed and healed. This is the beginning of the transformational relationship. It's when all the little spats start, and when we begin to wonder if our partner is batshit crazy or if they're thinking that about us. Incidentally, the tripwire also often triggers illness, which is another manifestation of the transformational relationship. As many of you know, I've worked with chronic illness for many years, and believe it or not, in that domain, I saw this a lot. Right after marriage, for example, right after moving in, boom, illness strikes. But perhaps for now, we can leave that more medical digression for another time. And so, all that being said, perhaps we should begin with what I've seen to be the primary guiding principle that can help us all within the transformational relationship. Outside of knowing that it's actually happening, developing a robust conflict mediation process, and yes, being willing to bear endless hours of processing/arguing. As I often say, if everything goes according to plan in the relationship, then for a period of time, you're going to have one drag out fight after another. And if you can continue to repair following those conflicts, it will transform you for the better. It will smooth you out and develop and heal you in all number of ways, like a semi-precious stone tumbling in a rock polisher. You can think of it like this. The depth of the conflict that you enter with your partner is proportionate to the glow you will feel when you repair from it. Now, I kind of just made that up, but I feel like it works. Let's try a different version. The intensity of the pain of the conflict you experience will be directly proportionate to the glow in the heart of the repair. Something like that. So roots deep, shoots high. You can only know heaven to the degree that you know hell, kind of thing. But back to the guiding principle. Here it comes. Bear with me. The guiding principle of the transformational relationship is that the more conscious individual within the couple bears the greater responsibility of shepherding the transformation, healing, and repair, period. Even though they will often be the meeker of the two. That's right, and you will have to figure out who that is. This will usually be the person who loses their shit least, but then perhaps squeezes it out in passive aggressiveness later. It's the one who's less dysregulated in arguments, but doesn't necessarily hold their own. It's the one who's less volatile, but perhaps stews. And at least interpersonally is the one who's more aware of the subtle energetics taking place, but less willing to hold their own, enter conflict, speak their truth. This individual is going to be the one that is more archetypally feminine. And historically, yes, the more archetypally feminine will be the woman. But of course, in modern times, it can also be the man. And it can be either member in a non binary relationship. Regardless which way you slice it, however, there's going to be someone in the relationship who has a higher perspective of the interpersonal details a higher proportion of the time. And not all the time, but a higher percentage. And that includes noticing more subtle nonverbal cues, passive aggressiveness, energetic assaults, the breaking of the tether, aka attachment and attachment rewounding, all of it. And the reason they bear the greater responsibility of pointing all this out and shepherding healing and repair should be obvious. If you're the more sensitive one, you're going to be the one who's feeling more and seeing more with more granularity. And you're going to have to speak up, or else it ain't going to be noticed and it ain't going to be addressed. But here's the rub: the archetypally feminine member in the couple is usually the one who's more chicken shit. And yes, sometimes there is flux to this. Sometimes this role changes depending on the scenario and whose trauma is being triggered in the moment. However, even in those cases, there is still usually one who holds the mantle of the feminine more generally overall. And what I'm suggesting over, years and years of seeing this in myself, in my own relationship, and in the couples work that I have done, I've seen it also expressed in the golden canon of archetypally coherent literature, most iconically in the Bible, which is why Eve gives the apple of self-awareness to Adam and not the other way around. And this is why the genius of the Apple logo is that it has one bite in it, the bite of a woman, the bite of the feminine. Similarly, Jane Austen knew this, which is why in Pride and Prejudice, she depicts this glorious, hilarious scene between a man and a woman riding a carriage side by side. And she describes the man, or in-depth psychological language, let's just say that archetypally masculine, holding the reins, waving to people with his top hat, being that archetypally masculine extroverted element leading the way, while the woman, the more archetypally feminine element, delicately and gently pulls at the reins of the horses, this way and that, almost without the masculine even noticing, gently guiding them both to avoid a pothole here, a ditch there, that the masculine would otherwise steer unconsciously and carelessly into. And this is kind of the perfect balance between the masculine and the feminine, not just within the couple, but within the psyche. The masculine drives, but the feminine guides. The masculine is like the big dial on the radio, and the feminine is like the little dial, the more nuanced, granular dial. And this also relates to the mathematical number of pi, I believe, and the golden ratio, which I'll be going into in a later episode. But that aside, what usually happens is that at the beginning of the relationship, when everything starts, you will often have an archetypally masculine driving and guiding, and an archetypally feminine seeing everything and saying nothing. And historically, yes, this trend has been epitomized by the toxic male and the doormat woman. And in the Greek myths, This is the entire founding lineage, starting with Uranos and Gaia, and then going to Kronos and Rhea, and then to a slight lesser degree, but not much, Zeus and Hera. And then, of course, to Narcissus and his girlfriend Echo, who only ever repeated everything he said. And so, as we can see in all these cases, we have the kind of stereotypical dumb, oblivious male running roughshod over the emasculated woman. Or once again, to put it more depth psychologically and take it out of the gender binary norm, we have an oblivious archetypal masculine riding roughshod over a disempowered anima, right? An oblivious, an excessive animus over relying on the yang and marginalizing the yin. And really, once again, this has nothing to do with men or women. They're archetypal fields and domains and impulses that originate within the personal psyche of all of us. And indeed, in recent times, we also have that traditional gender dynamic that I described flipped, where we now also have an overly masculine, toxic female who pairs with an emasculated doormat male. And although you might be mistaken for thinking this was a new trend as a result of the feminization of men and the understandable and inevitable and entirely forgivable overreach of feminism, it's actually a much older, ancient trend that goes back to the Greeks and probably earlier than them, and is, epitomized in the Perseus and Medusa myth. Medusa being the traumatized princess who became the overly masculine victim turned perpetrator Gorgon and began a reign of emasculating men, turning them to stone, literally petrifying them, until Perseus arrived and, yes, healed her, right, by holding a mirror to her dysfunction and decapitating her, aka therapeutically removing her complex, and in so doing, unleashing her greater feminine power and consciousness in the form of Pegasus, the winged horse, who sprang forth from her headless body. The symbol of the horse, of course, is a horse, of course, being one of the most powerful of all the feminine symbols, because it's the combination of preternatural sensitivity and, F-150 horsepower, with the wings topping it off being a symbol of elevated awareness and higher consciousness. So whether we're talking about a more modern masculine woman paired with a feminine man, or a more traditional masculine man paired with a feminine woman, we're going to be dealing with a transformation that takes place with both members and that wants to guide and grow each in the direction of the other. And the most common exchange that is taking place is that the more archetypally feminine member of the couple, being the more sensitive one, is developing the strength to enter conflict, to speak truth in a grounded, unflappable way, while the archetypally masculine member, no pun intended, is developing attunement, sensitivity, and the emotional resilience to enter into the vulnerability space, right? So the feminine is myelinating their ability to enter the heat of conflict, while the masculine is myelinating their nervous system to feel emotions and energies that they were previously disassociated from. And of course, now for the hard part. Why is this so difficult? And this is a complicated answer, but in some ways it's already pretty obvious, because the archetypally feminine is like the mother in the cave, who has developed this incredible attunement to every micro movement and sound of the child, and who we are now asking to step out into the tundra and face the tiger, which is to fire as radically a polarized neural net within her as you can get. Equally, we are asking the archetypally more masculine that has spent their whole life fighting and dissociating from feeling precisely to be a more effective warrior, to now hold that child and feel into the subtle emotional energy permeating that quiet container of the cave, within and without, which to him is agony. And this is kind of the brinkmanship that usually plays out in all number of ways. The archetypally feminine being terrified of entering into conflict and holding the other accountable, and the archetypally masculine terrified of feeling and flying into periodic defensive rages when tasked to. And we have to understand this is just the rudiments of the transformational relationship, going all the way back even to the legend of the blind prophet Tiresias, who we are told found a variation of the caduceus on the road and killed one of the snakes, which immediately turned him into a woman for 7 years. There's that magic number 7 again. After which he was turned back into a man. So even then, the dream of the collective unconscious via the myth was stating very clearly that we must pendulate from the polarity that we're born with into the opposite side to the degree that we can. If you're a man, to some degree, you must become a woman. If you know strength, you must become vulnerability. If you know how to give, you must learn how to take. If you know how to receive, you must now learn how to give, and on it goes. And in the transformational relationship, I call this establishing the rules of engagement, where I'm aware of your psyche's mandate, just as you are aware of mine. And even when we fight, we're able to encourage and support that part of each other, even if it goes against us in the moment, right? Even if I'm triggered and the cortisol is running and we're entirely convinced that we are each other's enemies, we still do everything we can to support and train that other side of us that is aching for growth and development, as true sparring partners do. This is sparring in good faith. This is fighting in good faith, by seeking to steel man their argument just as much as we try to straw man it, agreeing with and even celebrating their correct points, playing in good faith in that way, especially when it's about us. Take the very first time I got dysregulated with my significant other. I'll never forget it. We were in the park and we were chatting away, and I got triggered. And boy, did I start to bullshit her and myself, simply in an attempt to win the argument. And ever so slowly, she just put her hand on my leg, and very calmly, but with deep presence and care, she said, "Are you aware of this moment right now?" And I kind of stared at her and blinked. And she said, "This is you losing your shit. Can you see that?" And it was just so kind and so masterful that I had no choice but to just nod and mumble, "Yeah," and immediately begin to scramble to self-regulate myself. Because in that moment, the archetypally more feminine was clearly and respectfully and powerfully calling out a discrepancy in the relationship and in the archetypally more masculine. And most importantly, in a way that I could hear, that I could receive. And so consequently, the path of the masculine is, yes, one of slowing down, of making contact with that sensitivity that is required to be more present, more attuned to our own feelings and to the feelings of others, which are, yes, deeply disturbing to us and will often trigger those defensive, endlessly rationalized rages. This, I would even say, is the true fear of the warrior, confronting that internal emotional space where their true, repressed, psycho-emotional chaos actually resides. This is why we see so many hyper-masculine men in the world embroiled in endless drama. Because the psyche externalizes what is inside of it and attracts it towards us like a mirror for us to see and slowly, perhaps over many lifetimes, make the connection to the original wounds inside so we can actually finally heal them at ground zero, where they first began. Even men who have 5 wives, for example, or who are in lawsuits with women, are externalizing the difficulties they have with their anima or their internal feminine, their uncontacted emotional and traumatic depths. Those external experiences that they have are really renderings of their psychic interiority. A great warrior is often like the strongest walnut shell you've ever seen, with a feminine seed inside that is very small and very underdeveloped. And as a result, is very primitive, elemental, and therefore terrifying to them, like the wild, wasteful ocean, like a harpy, like a gorgon, like a siren, like a leviathan. A warrior isn't afraid of death. They are afraid of depth. Likewise, the feminine doesn't fear depth. They fear conflict. They are like jellyfish, learning to be men of war by developing the ability to healthily dissociate so they can enter conflict, execute against the complex, and exit safely and effectively, all done with grace. And we spar with each other over and over and over again in the dojo of the transformational relationship to transmit these two polarized neural nets to one another over time. And so, while there is so much more to say about this, and I've certainly excluded a tremendous amount, I'm going to stop here now. And next week, get into the great Isis and Osiris myth. And hopefully, this primer will allow you to delight even more fully in how incredible this ancient piece of literature speaks so perfectly to exactly this transformational process within the couple, and in so many creative and symbolic ways. So once again, thank you so much for listening, and peace in.